We began our discussion of Ner Shabbos, and I think there's a lot more to talk about. Let's begin with the Tanchuma that makes a comment that really is far-reaching. The Tanchuma says that a person should eat his Suda Shabbos li'or haner, to the light of the candle. And he quotes the pasuk in Yeshayahu Hanavi, "V'karasa la Shabbos oneg." Now, what's the connection between eating one's Suda li'or haner and the mitzvah of oneg? And in the language of the Tanchuma, which, if you want to see it, it's on the bottom of page 11, he says, person should not be eating his Suda Shabbos in darkness. He's required to eat to the light of the candle, Mishum Oneg. And Tosfos, in the very famous sugya in Bameh Adlikin in Shabbos Chafei Amid Beis, embellishes this idea of eating the Suda not in darkness, but to the light of the Ner. Tosfos writes that Hadlokas Ner b'Shabbos Chova mi'ikar tzivuyo mipi hanavim. And then he writes, very strange, Hadlokas Ner na'ahu ikar hakibud. Again, the emphasis is on this Ner Na'ah, this beautiful candle that lights, illuminates the room. But whereas Tosfos puts the emphasis on kavod, which is in the words of the Navi, the Tanchuma put the emphasis on oneg in the same pasuk in Yeshayahu Hanavi. But both of them speak about eating the Suda li'or haner. Rashi writes, Ein hasuda chashuva ela b'makom or ke'ein yemama. And it's fascinating that the Shibbolei Aleket, one of the late Rishonim, quotes a pasuk in Tanakh. The pasuk says, "The lechem baboker lasova." This is a pasuk in the context of man. What does it have to do with Ner Shabbos? And the Shibbolei Aleket writes that there's a tremendous embellishment of the Suda Shabbos when it's eaten li'or haner, derived from this pasuk, lechem baboker. Baboker means when there's light out, natural sunlight. Lasova. Lasova meaning he enjoys, he feels satiated because he's eating the meal to the light of day. And the Shibbolei Aleket derives from this pasuk that a person should be eating a Suda li'or haner, and that's going to embellish and enhance his Suda, and it's going to be lasova. So we see quite a few sources here that put the emphasis on the Suda, and specifically to eat the Suda li'or haner. That enhances the Suda. And there's a fascinating insight of the Torah T'mima. Now, to appreciate the Torah T'mima, we'll mention that the Gemara says in Yoma on Daf Ayin Gimel that Lo yochal odom tavshilo elo li'or haner. Again, the Gemara is not talking about Shabbos, it's talking about any su'uda that you eat, and he should eat it li'or haner. Why? Bishvil she'yisava, so that he should be satiated by his food, because otherwise he's going to walk out of his meal hungry. V'asumim ochlim v'enam sveim. Those who unfortunately cannot see will not be satiated. Ki enam ochlim lisova nafshon. They cannot satiate themselves with the food they eat if they can't see the food, if they eat in the dark. And therefore, Amru Rabotseinu hadlakas haner b'Shabbos chova hideshius aneg b'Shabbos b'Meichel u'b'Mishta. In other words, if he eats his Suda and he has the Or Haner to embellish the Suda, he'll achieve Oneg Shabbos. Why? Because he eats L'sova. Whereas unfortunately, a person doesn't see his food, doesn't eat L'sova, he doesn't achieve that sense of satiation, and he won't fulfill the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos. So we start with a statement that's true the whole week long, and it's an observation that one's Su'udah should be embellished by light, Baboker Yisbo, and then we hone in on a halachic chiyuv, namely Ner Shabbos, that he's obligated to light a Ner Shabbos in order to achieve the mitzvah of Oneg, which means to eat a Suda that brings him that sense of satiation, and that's Oneg Shabbos. And here we have an unbelievable chiddush of the Baal Torah Tmima. Bnei Yisrael come forward in Parshas B'Shalach, and they complain about the man. The Ata, with an ayin, right? The Ata nafshenu yevesha, we feel dried up because ein kol, we have nothing to eat. Bilti el haman einenu. All we can look forward to and see is the man. Why are they complaining about the man? Chazal tell us in Torah Shebal Peh that any time, any taste you want, you can taste in the man. Says the Torah Tmima, yeah, it's true. We can taste anything, but we can't see the food that we're tasting because all we see in front of us is man. Had we been able to see, that's the emphasis of the word einenu, then we would be satiated, we'd have no complaint. But as a result of eating whatever taste we get without seeing the food, because all we see is man, we are not reaching the state of satiation, and therefore we complain about the man. Now, at this point, we have to learn the Shiltei Giborim. The Shiltei Giborim, one of the late Rishonim, in his commentary on the Rif who codifies the halach of Ner Shabbos on Daf Ayin Aleph. Daf Yud Aleph. That's only in the pages of the Rif. It's really the sugyas on Chafei Amid Beis. But the Shiltei Giborim vacillates back and forth, bringing proofs this way and that way to the following question that he addresses. Of course, I have to light a Ner Shabbos. Of course, I'm obligated to eat a Seudah Shabbos. But do the two have to overlap? Am I required to eat my Seudah Shabbos to the Ner that I lit for the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos? Is there a separate independent mitzvah of Ner Shabbos and an independent mitzvah of Seudah Shabbos? I will have to eat my Seudah Shabbos to the Ner, but not the Ner Shabbos. I'll light up other Neros, or I'll have light coming in from here or there. Or is it one mitzvah that has to be integrated, Ner Shabbos, together with my Seudah Shabbos? And he vacillates back and forth. He wants to know what happens in the case of a person who sets up his Ner Shabbos inside his house, and then he makes a decision that he wants to eat in the Chatzer outside of his house. Let's say, for example, it's still light out, it's not dark, or he has other candles, other source of light. Does he have to stay put and eat the Seudah Shabbos exactly where he lit the Ner Shabbos? Or no, he lit the Ner Shabbos, he fulfilled his mitzvah, and the Seudah is an independent mitzvah. He'll eat the Seudah outside in the Chatzer, and he has he has light outside in the front. And he brings proofs this way or that way. He comes to no definite conclusion. In our contemporary life, society, when we have electric lights, a person could decide he likes or she likes the Ner Shabbos inside. And then they eat the Suda out on the porch. It's a nice breeze. It's a warm, summer days. Got electric lights out on the porch. And the final conclusion about this issue seems to be, at least from the Shilton Geborah's perspective, that one should eat the Seudah in the makom where he lit the Ner Shel Shabbos, to combine Ner Shabbos with the Seudah, which once again reflects the concept that we saw earlier in the Tanchuma, that the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos is Oneg Shabbos to enhance the Seudah, and therefore, if the Ner Shabbos is not enhancing your Seudah because you took the Seudah out, then you didn't really fulfill the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos. And in the Mishnah Berurah and the Bir Halacha, he brings down poskim who say that your mitzvah was not a mitzvah if you ate the meal elsewhere, and your bracha was not a bracha if you ate the meal elsewhere. You've got to eat li'ar haner. The Mishnah Berurah doesn't come to any definite conclusion, but he does have such a movement amongst the poskim. No?
Just basically, if you're going to follow this idea, then a person shouldn't maybe be making Shabbos early, where it's and eating. Is this what you're saying? And eating before it gets dark, because basically he's not going to get enhancement from the or.
Right. You remind me that there are poskim who say that even if you take Shabbos in early, the Kiddush and the Seudah should wait until after Shkia. And there are many different explanations for that, but one of them is right here in the Shilton Geborah, because the Oran, we have a principle called Shraga B'tira Mahani, that during the sunlight, there's no purpose to a Ner, it doesn't add anything. But if you wait till after Shkia, and there's some reflected light on the horizon, but you don't have the intense direct light of the sun, now it makes sense to eat your Seudah li'ar haner. So again, none of this is a final psak halacha. Certainly, though, it gives us a whole new insight to the Ner Shabbos, that we should view the Ner Shabbos as part of the Seudah, as part of the mitzvah of Oneg. We should eat our Seudah li'ar haner. And these poskim were quoting psukim, and in the case of the Tartamima, the entire complaint here of the Ochlei Aman is because the Seudah was not an enjoyable, satiating Seudah because there was no Aron Ner. And if that's inherent in the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos, if we would assume so, according to one side in the Shilton Geborah, then that has tremendous repercussions. They say about the Vilna Gaon, for example, that he used to light many, many candles. It makes a lot of sense in the light of our discussion, pardon the pun, in the light of our discussion, because you want to intensify the light so that your Seudah will be uplifted, will be upgraded by the Neros of Shabbos. So light as many Neros as you can. And I was told many, many years ago that Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik was makbid to tell his wife that before lighting the Ner Shabbos, she should shut off the lights, the electric lights, turn them on l'kavod Shabbos, then light the Shabbos candles, and have in mind when she makes the bracha that the bracha should be not only on the Neros, but also on the electric lights, which according to, the famous Reb Chaim Ozer held that you could actually be yotze the mitzvah of Ner with electricity, but leaving out that whole thing. The enhancement of Yeshuda should be related not just to the two, candles that you light, or if you light more, but also to the electric lights. So we really have a strong push to subsume the mitzvah and define the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos under the Oneg Shabbos, which means Suda Shabbos. But the Rambam is very strange. The Rambam has the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos in 2 chapters, in Perek Hey Milchus Shabbos and in Perek Lamed Milchus Shabbos. And there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy between the two. In Perek Hey Milchus Shabbos, the Rambam writes, Lokeach Shemen Umadlik es Haner Shezeu Bichlal Oneg. So in Perek Hey, the Rambam explicitly defines Ner Shabbos as Oneg Shabbos, which doesn't surprise us because we've been seeing this over and over again. In the Tanchuma, we saw it in the Tosfos, we saw it in the Shultei Giborim. This is Oneg Shabbos. But then we fast forward 25 chapters to Perek Lamed, and the Rambam speaks about the mitzvah of Kavod Shabbos. Tzorech l'saken beiso mibod yom, meaning on Erev Shabbos. This is where the Rambam discusses organizing the beds, making sure the beds are made as we get to Shabbos, changing your clothes for Shabbos, washing your body for Shabbos. And he writes, Tzorech l'saken beiso mibod yom mipnei kvod Shabbos. How does he do so? Yehi ner doluk l'kvod Shabbos. And the entire discussion in Perek Lamed is all about the mitzvah of Kvod Shabbos. And he integrates into the entire list of Kavod Shabbos Ner Daluk. First of all, why is he repeating himself? And secondly, in Perek Hey, he classifies Ner Shabbos as Oneg Shabbos, not Kavod Shabbos. And thirdly, the Rambam in Perek Hey puts all the emphasis on the chiyuv of Ner Shabbos as a separate independent entity. He doesn't integrate it into a whole, constellation of pu'ulos, of actions that he gets involved. It's just simply Ner Shabbos. And that's where the Rambam goes into detail, which we mentioned last week about different kinds of requirements. There's something called a reshus, and there's something called a chova. And in the case of a chova, you've got to sell the shirt off your back, and so forth and so on. Lirdof achrei mitzvah. And the Rambam uses Ner Shabbos as his paradigmic example of a mitzvah shel chova. All that is in Perek Hey. In Perek Lamed, he integrates Ner Shabbos into a whole series of actions, and he defines Ner Doluk as Kavod Shabbos. Now, I'm going to suggest here, if you have page 13 or 14, 3 different approaches to reconcile the Rambam. The first approach is that of the Chidah. The Chidah suggests in his famous work called Machzik Bracha that the Rambam was asking the following question. Are we dealing with someone, a person who fits the profile that he has plenty of nails the whole week long? Again, keep in mind that back in the day, nails were not like today. Today for a pittance, you buy a box of candles. Then candle manufacturing was a whole to-do. And he writes the following. Misha Ragil B'ner Kol Yemos HaShavua. For such an individual, Ein Or Haner B'Shabbat Mishum Oneg Lo. He thus says that the Rambam in Perek Hey is not addressing someone who has neros in abundance the whole week long, because if so, he's got neros there. Why should he light another Ner Shabbos for the mitzvah of Oneg? He has that same achievement of Oneg regardless of light, whether he likes the Ner Shabbos or he doesn't like the Ner Shabbos. He has neros the whole week long. But rather, the Rambam, for such an individual, addresses the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos in Perek Lamed as an act of hachana to prepare for Shabbos. In Perek Hey, the Rambam is addressing someone who's going to have to perhaps sell the shirt off his back in order to buy Neros for Shabbos. He doesn't have Neros the whole week long, but the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos generates an independent and unconditional obligation to go out and purchase a Ner for his Suda of Shabbos. And just to summarize, the approach of the Schidah, just methodologically, is to insist that the Rambam in Perek Hey is addressing one reality, one profile of a person, and in Perek Lamed a different profile of a person. Now we're going to present another approach to reconcile these two Rambams. And this approach is popular in a sefer called Tosefet Shabbos, which was written about 2 centuries ago. It says the following: where is he lighting the candle? If he's lighting candles in the room that he's eating in, that's where the Rambam classifies the mitzvah as Oneg Shabbos. If, on the other hand, he's lighting candles in other rooms of his house, so he already has a candle lit in the Chadar Ochel where he's going to eat, he's already fulfilled the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos, but now he has an additional mitzvah of Kavod Shabbos, to light candles in the other rooms. Now, this methodology is very fascinating, very exciting, at least to me personally, because what he's saying is, let's reconcile these two Rambams without indicating that the Rambam is talking about this profile here and this profile of a person there. Here, there's a guy who has plenty of Neros. Here's a guy who doesn't have Neros. But on the other hand, I have to admit that the Tosefet Shabbos is adding an ukimta here. He's adding something to the Rambam. The Rambam doesn't seem to indicate that he's lighting in one case in this room where he's eating, in the other case he's lighting in the other rooms. Conceptually, on a pure abstract level, it's a beautiful, beautiful mahalach in the Rambam. But to push it into the words of the Rambam is a little bit more of a stretch. And now we get to the third approach, and that is the approach of 2 of the more recent Achronim, Reb Tzadok HaKohen and the Brisker Rav. Again, 2 different generations, but relatively within the same period of time. They both came up with the same formulation, and that is that the Rambam maintains that there are 2 independent machayvim of the mitzvah Ner Shabbos. One machayv is Oneg Shabbos, and the other machayv is Kavod Shabbos. And the diuk in the Lashon is that the Rambam in Perek Lamed, where he classifies Ner Shabbos as Kavod Shabbos, adds 2 words, Miba'od Yom. And what that means is that the mitzvah of Kavod Shabbos can only be fulfilled Miba'od Yom, not because of the technicality. How could I light a Ner on Shabbos lo savaru eish b'chomosh v'seichem? We could talk about the Mogen Avram that we spoke about last week, in which case, Bein HaShmoshos, at least she might be able to instruct a guy to light the Shabbos candles. That would not be a key of Kavod Shabbos, says the Rambam. Because the way that these Achronim understand the Rambam, Kavod Shabbos requires before Shabbos. It's Hachana. And the Rambam emphasized that on Erev Shabbos, we're preparing ourselves to be Makabel, the Pnei Melech HaShabbos. That has to be implemented before Shabbos. What would be if the guy would, on your instruction, light the candles, not Erev Shabbos, but on Shabbos? Again, you have to work it all out, Bein HaShmoshos, and Amir Liakum Shvus, whatever it is. I'm not getting into that. But in such a case, you could fulfill the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos, but not the mitzvah of Kavod Shabbos. So in Perek Hey, the Rambam is talking about lighting candles on Shabbos. Of course, that's impossible in a general sense. But conceptually, the Rambam doesn't add Mibod Yom because conceptually it makes no difference when you light the candles, as long as the Rambam, as he puts it, Madlikas haner b'chlal oneg, so that he can enhance his Suda Shabbos and be Mekayim mitzvah of oneg Shabbos li'or haner. And if this be the case, then perhaps, my friend, we can now shed a new perspective. I don't want to use the word light, a new perspective on the issue that we mentioned at the outset, the Shiltei Giborim. The Shiltei Giborim vacillates back and forth as to whether or not I have to eat my Suda to the R of the Ner Shabbos. And the answer would be the following, that even if he would run out of his dining room and eat the Suda in the Chotzer, I wouldn't say that it's a brachal of Atol. No. I would say that at least he could salvage the bits of Kvod Shabbos. And for that matter, any light, any candle that he lights anywhere in his house could be a kiyum of Kvod Shabbos. When the Shiltei Giborim is mitzadeh that maybe he's got to eat the Suda li'or haner, that's because he's focused on the aspect of Oneg Shabbos. And with regard to Oneg Shabbos, this hadlaka has to be related to the Suda. The fact that he lights in one place and then he eats the Suda elsewhere, that doesn't engender in this Ner the status of Oneg Shabbos as part of his Su'uda. And in fact, we can go back now to a question that we raised a week ago. What is the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos? Is it the Maisa Hadlaka, the act of lighting, or is it having a Ner Doluk, if you recall? And perhaps we can suggest the following, that with regard to Kvod Shabbos, we have a whole list of activities, of actions that are meant to be performed before Shabbos Mibod Yom in order to be Mechabed and be Makabel the Shabbos. That requires a Maisa Hadlaka. But with regard to the aspect of Oneg Shabbos, meaning to enhance my Seudah Shabbos, I don't need a Maisa Hadlaka. And therefore, when Rabbeinu Tam in Tosfos on Daf Chaf Hei Amud Beis raises the question of a Ner that was Doluk early on Friday, Mibod Yom Gadol, and now it's Shabbos, the Ner is still lit. And you don't have to tell you, Rabosa, we have today Neros that can last for 72 hours and for a full week. Ahmad al-Islam, if you know what I mean. So he's got a light and it's lit and it would continue way into Shabbos. Does he have to put it out and light it again? And Rabbeinu Tam says yes. What does Rabbeinu Tam mean? Why? I'm going to eat my Suda, li'or haner. I will fulfill the requirement of the Tanchuma, of Tosfos, of Rashi, that I've enhanced my Suda with Or, Baboker, it's a Sviyah. But the answer is, there's a mitzvah of Kvod Shabbos. That hadlaka in the morning, with all due respect, it might help you for Oneg Shabbos if the light lasts until you eat your Suda, but it's not a kiyum of Kvod Shabbos. Why? Because you did not light it at a time period, in a time period that's close enough to Shabbos to be classified and qualified as Kvod Shabbos. Again, we have to determine exactly when that is. Maybe you have to plug a mitzvah, but whatever it might be. And here I'd like you to take a look on page 15. He has a very fascinating insight of the Beis Halevi. So we're going back from the Brisker Rav to his Zayda. And the issue is a sugya in Masechta Shabbos with regard to an overlap of Shabbos and Yom Kippurim. So on this particular occasion, the Gemara addresses, it's Shabbos and it's Yom Kippur. Now, this is a very sticky issue because there's one school of thought that says Yom Kippur, it's not a time for Ner, because normally the Ner would be lit in a bedroom as well in order to guarantee that you don't trip and fall in your bedroom if you're in pitch dark. But to light a candle in your bedroom, on Erev Yom Kippur, is a problem because of Chayshina, we also Lidover Acher, meaning since it's an Isur of Tashmish Amita, on Yom Kippur, we're not so excited about an Or Haner because it might lead to, some sort of, he sees his wife, whatever it might be, and that arouses him and so forth and so on. On the other hand, it's Shabbos. It's not just Yom Kippur, but it's also Shabbos. Shabbos requires an Or Haner. So here the Gemara records a machlokas between Abaye and Rav. Now, in order to appreciate this machlokas, we have to go back to something called an itron. Itron is a kind of I forget what it's called in English. Anyway, it's a kind of a ner that has a bad smell to it. You can look it up in Google, or if you have an art scroll there, you'll see at the beginning of the Mishnah. I don't have it in front of me. What is it called?
Paraffin.
Paraffin. Okay, anyway, it had a bad odor. And the Gemara says on this Mishnah, quote, Ein madlikin ner l'Shabbos be'itron, mipnei kvod haShabbos, that we do not choose itron for the Ner Shabbos. Amar Rava, mitoch sherecho shel itron ra, gazrinon shema yaniachas haner v'yetzer. He is so offended by the foul odor of the itron that he's going to pack his bags and leave that room where the ner is. Abaye says, v'yetzer. What difference it makes? Is there some sort of requirement in halacha that he has to be connected to the ner? Amalo Rava responds, Shani Omer, my opinion is, hadlokas ner b'Shabbos chov. What, they're not speaking the same language back and forth. So Tosafot says that it's not that Abaye denies that hadlokas ner Shabbos is a chov. In fact, the Mishnah says al sholosh noshim averos. Excuse me. Noshim mesos b'shas leidosim, etc., etc. So what is Abaye arguing? He cannot deny what's explicit in the Mishnah, that lighting a Ner Shabbos is a chov. The answer is that this is the issue of the Shiltei Gibor. Says the Beis HaLevi, Abaye understood that the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos is covered at Shabbos, and that means just light a candle. I couldn't care less where you eat your seudah, because the mitzvah is independent of Oneg Shabbos. Rav, on the other hand, is of the opinion that the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos is connected to and is an inherent part of Oneg Shabbos. Therefore, from Abaye's perspective, if there's a bad smell and he picks up and he leaves, doesn't matter. He was Mekayim Mitzvah Kod Shabbos. From Rav's perspective, if he's going to pack his bags and he won't eat his meal, the Or Haner, because he can't tolerate the smell, then Ani Omer Shadlochas Ner Shabbos Chova, meaning, says Tosas Chova, Lisod Es Suudaso Al Yad Haner, K'nei L'Kayim Mitzvahs Oneg, She'or Haner Hu Mishum Oneg. That's the Shita of Rav. And again, what we're really coming down to is the same issue as to whether or not mitzvahs ner Shabbos, chovas ner hadlokas is covered, and that's an Erev Shabbos thing. It's not connected to the Suda later on, or it's a mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos connected to the Suda. And that leads us to the machlokas about Shabbos and Yom Kippur. And here we have a sugya in Psachim on Daf Nun Gimel and Beis. Gemara records a machlokas between Rav Shimon ben Elazar and the Rabbanon in the case of an overlap between Yom Kippur and Shabbos. Rav Shimon says that even if in general we don't encourage lighting a ner of Yom Kippur for the reason that I mentioned earlier, but nevertheless now it's an overlap of Shabbos and we have to light the candles, and listen carefully, Mishum Kvod Shabbos. And the Chachamim say, leave it out. don't light these candles. It's Yom Kippur, Erev Yom Kippur. We don't light candles for Yom Kippur. Now, what exactly is going on over here? The Shita of Shimon is that he's chayav to light the candles b'shum kvod Shabbos. I mean, what does it have to do with any Yom Kippur or Yom Kippur on Shabbos? I mean, if you're telling me that there's a mitzvah of kavod Shabbos, so why not obligate? And again, this is the question that Samach. Again, right now we're not operating with the Gzeira, but in and of itself, if Rav Shimon Elazar is not worried about the Gzeira, in a case where Shabbos overlaps with Yom Kippur, again, the Yisur Tashon Amita is still intact. He's not fazed by that. But he's saying that on Yom Kippur, if it's not Shabbos, there's no mitzvah kvod Shabbos, or kvod Yom Kippur. On Shabbos, a mitzvah kvod Shabbos. What's this all about? I mean, if there's a mitzvah kvod Shabbos, why shouldn't there be a mitzvah kvod Yom Kippur? In fact, the pasuk l'kvod Hashem mechubar in that parak there in Yeshayahu Hanavi Nun Vav, Nun Ches, is actually referring to Yom Kippur Chazal. The answer is that, again, the language here is a little bit tricky, but what Rav Shimon has in mind is the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos. That's the element of Kvod Shabbos that he's focused on. There's no Oneg Shabbos on Yom Kippur because there's no Suda on Yom Kippur. But now, since it's Shabbos, Rav Shimon insists that he's chayav to be madlik the ner because every Shabbos he's chayav to madlik the ner. Again, on this particular Shabbos, he has no mitzvah of oneg because the mitzvah of oneg is trumped by Yom Kippur. But nevertheless, the mitzvah of oneg Shabbos was established as part of the mitzvah of kavod Shabbos. In Yom Kippur, they never did such a thing because they didn't have oneg Shabbos on Yom Kippur. There's no oneg Shabbos on Yom Kippur. But in the case of Shabbos, since the original enactment and the mechayev of Hadlakas Ner Shabbos was one particular aspect of kavod, namely the oneg of kavod, therefore, the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos now becomes independent of Seudah and oneg and takes on the complexion of kavod Shabbos. Not Mashain came in the case of Yom Kippur, since it was never a mitzvah of oneg Shabbos. Therefore, they never went that step further and enacted a mitzvah of Hadlakas Ner for Yom Kippur. The Rabbanan and the Chacham disagree, and they hold that Hadlakas Ner is Mishum Kavod, and therefore, if we have to undermine Hadlakas Ner on Yom Kippur because of the Geter Tashmish, then they would mevatel that mitzvah, even if Yom Kippur is Chal B'Shabbos. So again, just to summarize the last couple of points we made, if you have a ner mibod yom, you have to put it out and rekindle it. That should depend upon kavod or oneg. If you're eating the Suda here and you lit the candles there, or you don't say the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos. If Ner Shabbos is oneg, the answer is no. If Ner Shabbos is kavod, the answer is yes. Would you be yotzei the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos on Shabbos? Let's say in the Hechatimtza where the guy lit for you. If it's oneg Shabbos, the answer is yes. If it's kavod Shabbos, no. Kavod Shabbos requires an act of hadlaka mibod yom. And is the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos the Maisa hadlaka or the Ner Doluk from the perspective of kavod Shabbos? The answer is Maisa mitzvah, Maisa hadlaka. From the perspective of what? Of oneg, it's the Ner Doluk. And that leads us back to what we discussed, Joe, I'll be right with you, about the two paradigms, the Ner Shebemigdash as opposed to Ner Chanukah. In the case of Ner Shebemigdash, we saw that the Rambam Shita is that it's kosher bizarre. and that means that the mitzvah is Ner Doluk, and using that as a paradigm for Ner Shabbos, the mitzvah Ner Shabbos, Ner Doluk is Kavod Shabbos, is Oneg Shabbos, whereas if we use Chanukah as a paradigm, then we paskin Hadlokos a mitzvah, and the mitzvah is Hadlokah, and if we use that by analogy to Ner Shabbos, we're talking about the mitzvah of Kavod Shabbos, which requires a Ma'aseh Hadlokah. Would you be Yotzei Ner Shabbos with a Cheresh Shota V'Katan? And the answer is the same Chakira that we have here. If it's the Ma'aseh Hadlokah, then Cheresh Shota V'Katan cannot generate a Ma'aseh Hadlokah. If it's the Ner Doluk, it doesn't matter. The Chazon Ish says even if a kof, a monkey would light it, you would be Yotzei. Yeah, Joseph.
Just the Rav Kiplan is always coming back to the eating, but but at the same time is hinting at stubbing his toe and stuff like that with it. So isn't that something to take into account as well with regards to kavod and oneg?
There's one part of your sentence I didn't catch. With regard to Torah, did you say Torah?
Stubbing his toe. In other words, the light, the fact that he needs the light to be able to get around in his house.
Oh, okay, great, excellent. So that's now the last part of this essay, which is on page 17, addresses your question. We've been speaking about Oneg Shabbos. We've been speaking about Kavod Shabbos. The Gemara talks about something else, and that's Sholem Bayis. Where does Sholem Bayis fit into this picture? And the Gemara is so emphatic about Sholem Bayis that the Gemara says that if you have a choice financially between Kiddush Hayom to buy wine or Ner for Shabbos, you buy Ner Shabbos because Sholem Bayis is greater and trumps Kiddush. And if you have a choice between buying a Ner Chanukah and a Ner Shabbos, you buy Ner Shabbos because of Sholem Bayis. Obviously, Sholem Bayis is a major player with regard to the essence of this mitzvah of Ner Shabbos. And yet, over and over again, we've been seeing throughout the Makorot, whether it's Chazal, whether it's the Rishonim and the Achronim, they all put the emphasis here on either Oneg or Kavod. And on these two pages, 17 and 18, the Mechaber here, Rabbi Mirsky, Shlita, quotes many sources to try to prove that there's no independent category called Sholem Bayis. That the phrase Sholem Bayis is really indicative or interchangeable, if you will, with Oneg and Kavod. And if you take a look, for example, at the beginning of Bameh Madlikin, Tosfos quotes the Rivan, one of the Balei Tosfos, that when the Mishnah tells you Bameh Madlikin and Bameh Ein Madlikin, he says that there are certain oils that Ein Madlikin Bahem because Shemi Chabe Haner, says the Rivan, V'leka Sholem Bayis. Now watch this. You and I would have said that since Ner Shabbos, as opposed to Ner Chanukah, for example, is mutar l'shtamish li'oro. Imagine you're reading a book to the Ner Shabbos, and all of a sudden it starts flickering because the oil is not coming down properly into the receptacle where the psila is, where the wick is. So the light is flickering, and we have a gzera called Sheva Yatim. So therefore, you want to get the best quality oils to make sure that the inferior quality oils will not be used. because of Shema Yates HaNer. He might violate the Isur Moleches Havara. And instead, the Rivan says that the reason why the Mishnah disqualifies these lower quality, inferior quality oils is for a different reason at all altogether. That Shema Yichab HaNer Vileka Shalom Bayis. And basically, all the early Rishonim that understood from this Rivan that the Kpeda, that we're very careful to get the right oils, is a reflection of this dimension of the mitzvah Ner Shabbos called Shalom Bayis. Comes along the Siyunim LaTorah. Again, the name of the book is not important, but the author's name is important. His name is Rabbi Yosef Engel. I don't know if you heard of him. He lived, at the beginning of the 20th century. He died probably early in the 20th century. He was a genius of geniuses, Rabbi Yosef Engel. And he writes that what's this whole business about Shalom Bayis? Are you telling me that we're afraid that he's going to walk into the wall, that he's going to trip and Chas v'Shalom break a leg? What does that have to do with Shabbos? If there's a mitzvah called Shalom Bayis for the sake of protection and security to make sure that he doesn't break his leg, then that's not a mitzvah of Shabbos. That should apply the whole week long. And that's what he quotes here from Rabbi Yosef Engel. I'll quote it to you. Im mitam shalom bayis yechiyuv hadlokas ner tamid gam b'yamos hachol. I mean, it sounds like a brilliant chap. And therefore, he says, the Rambam, if you read him carefully, completely omits mention of shalom bayis. He quotes the Halachos Ktanos. I have it in Harnov. And Halachos Ktanos writes, the Taima de Shalom Bayis b'chol laila isim. Right? Like we say, Manishtana, we call Leilos Hashem. We call Leilos. Ulachem, the Rambam leaves out Taima de Shalom Bayis, the Hosif the Ika Onik Shabbos. The Rambam quotes Onik Shabbos. But again, how do we reconcile that with the sugyas that the Gemara puts Ner Shabbos on the top of your priority list, trumping Kiddush and Ner Chanukah because of Shalom Bayis? What are you telling me? You're telling me that the Rambam omits Shalom Bayis? The Rambam paskins that if you have a choice between Kiddush and Ner Shabbos, you have to spend your money on Ner Shabbos. You have a choice between Ner Chanukah and Ner Shabbos. You spend the couple of prutos you have in your pocket for Ner Shabbos. And the Gemara says that's from Shalom Bayis. So take out the Gemara, cross it out. It doesn't say Shalom Bayis. Sami Mikan, instead write, Yesh Garsim Onik Shabbos. They're very difficult. The whole thing is baffling. On page.
Can I ask a question?
Oh yes, please. But I don't see you. I don't know where are you?
I try to put
Oh, that's
me in. My
Paul.
name is Paul. Okay. Is it discussed anywhere about the blind person who can't see the Ner Shabbat,
Yeah.
and technically he can't taste his food because he can't see the light? What kind of situation does that bring up?
Well, so far from what we saw, I don't know what we'll see later. We only have a few minutes, but from what we saw now, in the case of the blind person, we have a mitzvah called Kavod Shabbos. We said that there are two dimensions to the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos. That's what we saw until this point. We haven't gotten into Shalom Bayis. and one is oneg to enhance your seuda, and the other is covered. And therefore, the suma, the blind person, would be chayav in covered Shabbos, but not in oneg Shabbos. Now, as far as Ner Chanukah is concerned, again, I don't want to get off too much on a tangent because I want to get back to our discussion now about Shalom Bayis. The poskim say that a suma is going to make a bracha on Ner Chanukah because he's being mefarsing the nest to others who could see his candle. Would that have a parallel in Ner Shabbos? That although the Suma might not be able to see the Ner and therefore he doesn't enhance his Oneg Shabbos, his Suda, but maybe he could light the Ner Shabbos as Oneg Shabbos because he's enhancing Yenim Suda. Maybe. I haven't seen such a thing, but maybe we could say so. But just to get back on track for a moment, because time is our worst enemy here, as far as the concept of Oneg Shabbos is concerned, there's a Pella here in the language of the Aruch HaShulchan. You know, I'm a gigantic fan of the Aruch HaShulchan, but in this case, I feel totally left out. I don't know. It doesn't resonate. He says, Kol Shalom Bayis B'Oneg Shabbos. Once again, Sami Mikan. You know, cross out covered Shabbos, and I'm sorry, cross out Shalom Bayis and put in Oneg Shabbos. And then just to confuse us more, he writes on the top of page 18, Makom Sha'ochlim Havim covered Shabbos. I mean, that undermines everything we said in the discussion today. We said Makom Sha'ochlim is Oneg Shabbos. He's classifying it as covered Shabbos. Maybe he means, like we said earlier, with regard to the Sugim Psachim, that covered Shabbos is like an umbrella concept, and Suda and Oneg Shabbos is included under covered Shabbos. And then he writes, Ubishari Hadarim having the Oneg Shabbos. Again, undermining everything that we've said until now. We said that lighting in other rooms, other than the dining room, is covered Shabbos. He calls that Oneg Shabbos. So when you light in the place where you eat, he calls that covered Shabbos. When you light in the other rooms of the house, that's called Oneg Shabbos. And when we talk about Shalom Bayis, we're talking about lighting candles in other rooms of the house for the sake of Oneg Shabbos. So cross out Shalom Bayis and replace it with the phrase Shalom Bayis. And it's very strange because he quotes a pasuk here that Vatiznach Mishal Nafshi, and Chazal interpret that pasuk as an allusion to Halakas Ner Shabbos, and they write Kishiyesh Ner Yesh Shalom, right? That's the pasuk says Shalom Nafshi. He says this pasuk, which is quoted in the context of Shalom Bayis, is Etzem Tikun HaBracha Mochiach She'ed Loka Mishum Shalom Bayis. It's not a matter of Shalo Yikoshel, he shouldn't fall and break a leg, Chas V'Shalom. And he says a lumdus here. He says the Imkain, if you're going to take Ner Shabbos as Shalom Bayis, then there's no bracha. Why? Because if you're protecting yourself from danger, that's called Hatzola Min HaSakana. There's no mitzvah of Hatzola Min HaSakana. He claims that that's only an obligation that evolves from Ushmartem Yodas Nafshel Seichem. We don't make a bracha on Ushmartem Yodas Nafshel Seichem. You know, you take a pill. We mentioned in Corona a few months ago that maybe when you get the shot, you should make a bracha. But we don't make a bracha on Ushmartem Yodas Nafshel Seichem. And if that's what Shalom Bayis is all about, there would be no bracha. We don't make a bracha on Mayim Achronim because Mayim Achronim is Mishum Sakana. And therefore, if there's a chiyuv bracha in Adlokas Ner Shabbos, it must be because of the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos, not because of Shalom Bayis. So what do we do with the Gemara? The Gemara says, Ner Beiso B'Kiddush Hayom Ner Beso Adif Mishum Shalom Bayis. That's a verbatim quote of the Gemara. Says the Rashba, Hamachuvan Bezeh L'Ner Beso L'Tzorach Seudah. So again, until now we've been quoting the Achronim, Rabbi Yosef Engel, and we quoted the Aruch HaShulchan, but now we're quoting a Rashba. And the Rashba is saying that when it says in the Gemara, Ner Beso Adif, it's Adif because of the Su'ud of Shabbos. It means that Shalom Bayis is not about danger, lest Chas v'Shalom he break his leg, but about the ability to enhance his Su'udah, and that's the Shalom Bayis. I don't know what to say here, Ramos. I have to tell you that this whole thing just baffles me to no end. And the argument of Rabbi Yosef Engel doesn't faze me. He's asking, well, why don't we have a mitzvah of Ner Shabbos, of Shalom Bayis the whole week long? The answer is, you know what? The whole week long, he'll light up the illuminate his house. He can't do that on Shabbos. So Chazal made a takana mishum Shalom Bayis. Or at least grant me that there's an extra element here above and beyond kavod and Suda Shabbos of Oneg. There's another element of Shalom Bayis. And I'll be honest with you. Usually, I don't like to do meta halakhic thinking. I like to think within the strict context of halach. But in this case, if I can allow myself a little literary license here, poetic license, I would say that Shalom Bayis is a reflection of what Shabbos is all about. When we say Shabbat Shalom, right? What do we mean by that? Shabbos is meant to be the day of harmony. All of the period, all the contentions, between Lamala, Lamata, and all the Yetzaharas. Here we have an Neshama Yisera, and the Shabbos represents Shalom. But in any event, what I'm trying to convey is that Shalom Bayis adds another element into the equation. It could be that if we were only at the level of Oneg Shabbos and we have Kiddush, all right, Kiddush maybe is not Oneg Shabbos, but Kiddush is a great mitzvah. There's a sheet of Rashi in the Masechet Nazir that Kiddush al Yayin is D'oraisa. And I'm not saying anybody can take that too seriously, although Rashi seems to say that a Nazir will recite Kiddush on Yayin on Shabbos. Wow, Nazir is D'oraisa, he's not allowed to drink wine. But be that as it may, Kiddush al Yayin is a major mitzvah, not something to be mezalzel in. But although maybe Oneg Shabbos and Ner Shabbos is on par, I don't know which is greater and which should supersede and trump. But what I do know is that Shabbos has another element. Ner Shabbos is Shalom Bayis. And here, what we do is we walk into a room, and instead of walking into a dark room on Shabbos, and every single thing, disturbs us, and we bang our heads and our bodies into this, that, and the other thing, all of a sudden we have Ner Shabbos, and we see the beautiful harmony in the room. This is a table, and this is a chair, and this is a fender, and this is a sefer, and everything blends into one integrated whole. And the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, as we say in Gestalt psychology. And that means that there's an element here of Shalom Bayis. And that's something that is very, very significant halachically. And I think I mentioned to you that the story goes, I think I may have read it in Rabbi Krohn's book, but it's quite a famous story, even before Rabbi Krohn publicized it, that the Chafetz Chaim, as I mentioned to you, was waiting the night of Hanukkah till his wife came home. She was delayed, and he was very makpid to light Ner Hanukkah at the earliest time. And when his grandson asked him why, he said, because if Shalom Bayis is greater than Ner Hanukkah, and I'll prove it to you from Ner Shabbos, then for Shalom Bayis, I have to wait for my wife. That overrides Ner Chanukah. And at the end of this whole discussion, he quotes the Levush. The Levush, Rav Mordechai Yafo, as you know, was a contemporary of Yosef Karo. And if not for the fact that the publisher published Rav Yosef Kairo's Shulchan Aruch before the Levush got to publish his Levush, we could have had a different Shulchan Aruch, and Jewish history would have looked a lot differently. But the Levush writes on the bottom of page 18, Echad Anoshim v'Echad Noshim Chayovos Bo. The obligation of Ner Shabbos is incumbent on both men and women. Mishum Shalom Bayis. I got very excited about this. I thought the Levush was going to save me and take the Gemara literally, that Ner Shabbos is Shalom Bayis. But instead he writes, just to disappoint me, Umadlikas Haner Lekavod Onik Shabbos. So I don't know what he means. Very, very ambiguous. This whole discussion about where Shalom Bayis fits in to everything that we've evolved here and developed with regard to Ner Shabbos is very, very confusing. Joe or Bobby, I don't know who. Yeah.
Joe is first.
Me?
Oh, so you're okay,
So,
Joe.
Rav, maybe
Oh, go ahead.
maybe that's the key. Maybe that's the key, Rav, is that because, like you said, the Shalom Bayis would tell you that you would need a light all the time, right? In your house, the mitzvah. But the idea is that you can always light wherever you're going, and you see that it's that it's dark. You're able to light you're able to turn on a light. So therefore, it all comes back to kavod. Kavod Shabbos is that strength, has that massive power to it. That's the key ingredient for Shalom Bayis. It's got to be, you've got to put it, that's where it's concentrated on, because you have to make sure that there's light in the play, in wherever you're eating, or wherever you're walking, and that comes to the mitzvah of kavod. Am I making any sense?
So then again, what we're coming back to is, in a sense, a broader definition of kavod. Until now, we decided that kavod was, preparing the house for the melech who's coming to greet you as a guest on Shabbos. Now we're saying, no, kavod is something that, in a broad sense, includes anything that would enhance your Shabbos, your behavior, your comfort on Shabbos. Instead of walking into a wall and breaking your leg, chas v'sholom, you have a light. That's also called kavod Shabbos. And just by the way, he quotes here on page 19, at the very end of this essay, a line from Reb Tzadok HaKohen. And at one point, I got very excited about Reb Tzadok HaKohen. And I'm still excited about Reb Tzadok HaKohen, but he adds one thing that really bothers me. But I don't think it's critical. I think in my own humble way, I can accept what Reb Tzadok HaKohen is saying without adding that little piece. He writes on the top of page 19 that Shalom Bayis is Shalvas HaNefesh. Brings a person to a state of calm, of serenity. He's at home with himself. And Reb Tzadok says, so why on Shabbos is there such an emphasis on Shalvas HaNefesh? And here's where I lose him. He says that on Shabbos, there is more of a danger of ktata b'bayis, of confrontations in the house. See, here's where I lose him. He says that on Shabbos, no one's busy out there. We're all resting at home. We're enjoying the delights of Shabbos. Al kain yavo l'ktata. So we need that Ner of Shabbos to penetrate into our souls and enhance our Shalvas HaNefesh so that we don't come to family feuds. I don't know. It's a little bit disparaging, to think that, family feuds are more, there's a greater propensity for family feuds on Shabbos than there is during the week. But I guess in order to counter that, we have the Ner Shabbos Mishum Shalom Bayis. So the Ner Shabbos of Shalom Bayis will guarantee the peace at home amongst the members of the household. Again, I would leave out that last sentence. I know, in my humble opinion, it's called on Mosif Korea. Ruvain, is that you?
Yes, that's me. But this comes in line with looking at the Ner Shabbat as we make Kiddush, Shemaim V'aretz. That hints to more of a Shalom Bayis.
I mean, the idea of finding peace between the higher realms of existence of Shamayim and the lower realms of man on earth. Is that what you mean?
That's what it seems. That's what it would seem like.
Right. Bobby, let me just ask Mechila. I just want to add one little thing because then we finish the whole piece. And then what he says now on page 19 in this large paragraph to complete it, the Mishnah says, "Bameh madlikin ubameh ein madlikin." We would have anticipated that the Gemara would ask, Tana Heicha Kod, like at the beginning of Shas, right? Tana Heicha Kod. And he wants to develop, based on Rabbi Lezer Bimetz, the Sefer Yereim, the possibility that Ner Shabbos was min Sinai. It was coming from Sinai. It's Doraisa. And it was so well known that from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu went on, they were lighting their Shabbos. There was no need to ask Tana Heicha Kod. If you want to know when is Kriya Shema Shal Arvis, first tell me B'Shal B'Chov Kumecha that you have a double chiyuv of Kriya Shema. But we would never have asked the question, how do you know there's a mitzvah to Chov of Ner Shabbos? Because that's a Kabbalah that goes back to our Sinai, and a mitzvah which is classified by the Sefer Yereim as Doraisa. The mitzvahs Ner Shabbos, Haisa Mekubeles BiYisrael, Me'az Umikedem. And therefore there was no reason to ask the question of Tana Heicha Kod. And he embellishes this idea with the concept of Re'iyah, of seeing the Ner. And he says that seeing is a metaphor for not just physical seeing, but also for spiritual insight, which you'll see here on the bottom of page 19. He calls it a Re'iyah Shel HaLev, Re'iyah, not of the eyes, but of the heart, Re'iyah Ruchanit, a spiritual vision that is represented by Shabbos, to the extent to which the Gemara at the end of Taanis tells us that when Rav Chanina ben Dosa's daughter accidentally lit chometz, vinegar, instead of wine, instead of oil, Rav Chanina ben Dosa says, don't get upset. She was all upset. And he declares that me sha'omar l'shemen b'yadik, yomar l'chometz b'yadik. How could Rav Chanina ben Dosa be so sure that this miracle would take place, that chometz would light? Normally it cannot light, and the Gemara reports that it lit the entire Shabbos until Motzei Shabbos, this chometz. And he wraps it up on page 20 beautifully, and he says that Rav Chanina ben Dosa, when he looked at the Ner of Shabbos, he didn't see shemen, he didn't see oil. He didn't see something in physical nature. What he saw was a re'iyah ruchanit. He saw something below the physical surface. He saw something that is representative of the great miracles of Shabbos, of the shalom bayis of Shabbos, of the covenant owning of Shabbos. And therefore, in his mind, what difference does it make whether it's shemen or chometz? The same Ribbono Shel Olam who said that we light shemen will tell us that we light chometz, and the chometz will light. And therefore, he says throughout Jewish history, there was so much kpeda, so much of a meticulous emphasis and dedication to the Ner Shabbos. And he says, I mean, I'm just adding this, you don't have to be a Chabadnik to put emphasis on Ner Shabbos. The Gaon Mivilna was not a Chabadnik, probably not even a potential Chabadnik. And yet, in the Sefer, which is called Ma'aser Rav, they testify that the Gaon went out of his way, lighting as many candles as he could for Ner Shabbos, until the Rofe told him to stop. Now, I don't know why, if somebody could figure this out, I don't think it's a financial consideration, but it says, Mana'u arofim lahadlik neros harbe midah. So I don't know, I don't have access to the Ma'aser Rav.
Maybe it polluted the air, like the air got too.
Maybe it wasn't good for the lungs, and
Right.
the Gaon was getting old. But up until that point, until the Rofim told him die, he would add more and more candles. Ribui haneros shehidlik hagra lechayer bebeso b'Shabbos. And he quotes one of the Achronim after the Gaon, the Divrei Shlomo. He was the Rav in Vilna after the Gaon, who claims that the Gaon was on a campaign against the Tzdukim, because the Tzdukim, or maybe the Karoim, who were an offshoot of the Tzdukim, they said that when it says in the Pasuk, Lo sevaru eish b'chol moshvosechem, it means you shouldn't have eish lit b'chol moshvosechem, what we call ner dol. And therefore, in order to fight this battle against the Tzdukim, the Gaon took it upon himself to light as many, many candles as he possibly could. Kedei listar es divreim, sheishis yomim tasem ulacha, b'yom hashvi yilachem Shabbat Shabbos Hashem, kol ha'osef b'malacha yumas, lo sevaru eish b'chol moshvosechem b'yom HaShabbos. And he says that the Torah added these two superfluous words, b'yom HaShabbos, in order to teach us that although lo sevaru eish on Shabbos, but nevertheless, there should be light on Shabbos, b'yom HaShabbos. And the diuk is b'yom HaShabbos, i'ata mavir eish, aval mavir eish me erev Shabbos l'Shabbos. And that indicates the mitzvah in the Torah itself of Ner Shabbos. When we walk away from this essay with all our discussions about the nuances, we should also remember this chunk, that it's possible, again, don't put me in cherem for saying this, but it's possible that Ner Shabbos is d'oraisa. Again, it's a far-flung shita, but we have hints at it in the Sefer Yereim, in the Medrash, and in the Gaon. Adkan. Yeah.
So I'd like to, maybe it's a bit of a shtickle Torah, and I have to understand the sugya better to really know whether it makes sense. But can we not say that there are really three elements here? There's Kavod Shabbos, Einik Shabbos, and Shalom Bayis. And Kavod Shabbos is the preparation for Shabbos. And I think you need to understand how the Neiros of Kavod Shabbos work in preparation of Shabbos. And you say, Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbos, that's Al Kavod Shabbos. And whether those have to be lit even when you go into Shabbos, one could question. Then there's an inyan of Einik Shabbos, which means that when you eat your meal, you have to have light. And then there's an inyan of Shalom Bayis. And I would say that the inyan of Shalom Bayis is all the time, all week. And if you're medayik in the lashon of the Mishnah, it doesn't say Ner Shabbos v'kiddush hayayim. It says Ner Beisai v'kiddush hayayim. In other words, the shaila is, if I need light for my house, never mind Shabbos. It happens to be it's Shabbos because the shaila is kiddush hayayim. If I need light for my house, not Einik Shabbos, not Kovod Shabbos, I need light for my house, and I have kiddush. Which do I take? I take Ner Beisai al Shalom Bayis, which is something that applies all the time. You can be yaitze your Einik Shabbos with the same neiros as Shalom Bayis neiros, but it's really two independent concepts in that sense. That Ner Beisai, you have to have light in your house, period, all the time. Then
So the Tana de Messiah that I would quote to support you is Rav Yosef Ein, because he's very much in this way of thinking that Shalom Bayis is something that applies the whole week long. And we saw perhaps on page 17, open the Sefer again, something similar in the language of the Mitzvahs Ketanos. There it is. The Halachos Ketanos, the time of the Shalom Bayis b'chol laila isa. That could bring support to your approach.
In other words, and why doesn't it say when Rava says Ner Beisai v'kiddush hayayim? Why does it say Ner Shabbos v'kiddush hayayim?
Right.
Why does he say Ner
And why is
Beisai?
the Rambam omit Shalom Bayis?
So the Rambam doesn't say Shalom Bayis because he's talking about Hilchos Shabbos.
Right.
And Shalom Bayis is not. So
again, I'm not telling you, Bobby, that I believe that that's emes, but it's definitely support for what you're saying.
I'm asking whether that shtickle Torah works, and then also the shaila, and I would go back to what you said from Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, that he told his wife to think about the electric lights, because that if you want to have, in other words, else the idea of Kovod Shabbos, you have to have the Shabbos lights lit for Shabbos. Else the idea of we need to have some kind of Shabbos lighting neiros for that. But Al Shalom Bayis and the idea that people light in one place.
But he wanted the bracha to be chal on.
Yeah. So
does that fit into your perspective?
Right. So that I would say is just a sort of a shufra, like in other words,
right.
Once you're already lighting, you may as well have in mind that's because when you light for Kovod Shabbos, it's nice to have in mind Einik Shabbos also. But Lamaisa, if you just have your Kovod Shabbos in mind when you light the neiros, that's probably your chiyuv of neiros of hadlik ner Shabbos. You're not at your Einik Shabbos until you eat your meat.
Okay. And I do have a question.
Yeah, I'm listening.
Rabbi Berzon.
I'm listening.
Rabbi,
this is Ethel.
Yeah, hi, Rabbi Berzon.
Are you back in Israel
Thank you.
now, or?
Oh yeah, I just came back. I couldn't wait to hear your share.
I didn't know what
Thank
time of the day it is on your clock.
That's right. No. But I did have a question that I always deal with, because if I go to eat at my neighbor's house Friday night, I want to light candles in my home. But I'm not eating the meal in their house, or do I get there before and light at their house? There's a big question I always have.
For that, I'm gonna force you to listen to last week's shir. This is the second and the end of the series.
Recorded?
Two shiurim. Yeah.
Is it
So we
recorded?
discussed that issue at great length. If you have the time, if you're not too jet lagged, then
No, I'm fine. How do I get the shir?
so I can send you a link. God, do I have your contact information?
Yes.
I think I do.
Yeah.
So Bli Neder, I'll send you a link. Otherwise, what you do is you go on to YU Torah, and you have to have a calendar in front of you. Take a look at last Wednesday at this exact time, just a week ago. So how many days are there in May? There's 31.
Yeah,
And today is the 2nd of June. Is that right?
the
Yeah.
1st of, oh, the second.
Oh, today's the 1st of June?
Yeah.
Second
Oh,
of
it's the
June.
second?
Yeah,
Okay.
you lost a day in traveling. Anyway, today's the 2nd of June, so you want to go back to the 26th, would have been, the 26th of May would have been last
Right,
Wednesday.
and then
Is that
how do I
correct?
get if you could send me the link, I would appreciate it.
Yeah,
if not,
it's called
I'll, you
YU
know.
Torah.
YU Torah, and it's under your name.
Well, no, YU Torah, then you'll see something called speakers and authors. And then when you click on that, you could start a few letters of my name, and then my page will show up. And then,
Okay,
yeah, but anyway, I'll
because that's
send you,
always
God
a
willing,
dilemma I have.
Buli Neder, I'll send you.
Okay, it's a dilemma that I have, because
Yeah.
I never know, do I
Sure,
light at that
sure.
person's house, or do
Yeah.
I light at home? Very
Yeah.
good. All right, Yasher
All right,
Koach.
then,
Thank
so
you.
let me wish everyone a fine day, a fine week, and
One more thing.
Thank you again.
yeah, thank you. David, one question I wanted to ask you, David. What,
Okay.
at the end of the day, were you able to find the sefer or not?
No, the shul doesn't
No.
have it. I asked one of the YU Yingalite. I said, maybe you guys know where it is. They said, no, we've never seen it.
You
I
never
see
saw
my-
the sefer.
I see my
So-
shtickle Torah was not Kubal. I got kicked out.
I didn't kick you out.
I have one more thing I
No,
want to say. Okay, so I looked up Itron and it's tar. It smells bad. That's why I can't
Sorry.
eat it. The
Oh,
parrot is something else.
okay, so now we know that Ichon is called